it's the only argument I've heard is that like it's more robust, as in like 0 is in Fahrenheit, 0 is really cold, 100 is really hot. In Celsius, 0 is really cold, and like 100 is death, right?
Yeah, that's what we
No,
mean.
like
It's
each
more
Fahrenheit is
precise.
literally more precise. Like
Than
this is
each
1
Celsius.
Celsius, and this is like 1 Fahrenheit. That means like it's more precise.
But like
Correct.
fair, but like in relation to like I don't know, it's just, like everybody else uses Celsius. It's just America. Stop.
Wow.
Hey, tell me, who has put a man on the moon? Like 3 times, 5 times.
So true.
Who?
It was because of the metric system issue that some rockets.
First of all, yeah, a rocket
Irrelevant.
blew up because we use like yards.
Yeah, because you guys were using meters. It was like a conversion issue. If you guys were using feet, it would have been fine. Everything would have been fine.
A feet in space is nothing.
What?
A meter is a much better.
Rohan, did you hear about like the whole like after Brexit, the UK will like consider?
Oh, they're switching back? No, you know, I realized they actually measure road distances in miles. Like when I went to Scotland, they literally have everything in miles.
When you like go to an Irish pub or something, you gotta find.
Yeah, exactly. Most of them do use the like imperial system. Okay, all right, let's talk about, we can discuss the ethics of measurement systems later today, but first let us talk about ethics. All right, so today we're talking about ethics, sociopolitics, and aesthetics. This may sound very boring to some people. I think I'm gonna do this every week actually. Who does this sound boring to? All right, Sid has 2 hands up. Okay, no, because like with literature, like I think that's like a boring topic to a lot of people. No, like I mean, to me, like a few years ago, literature would have sounded like, damn, that's boring. But okay, cool. Good to hear that people find this interesting, at least. Okay, icebreakers. This is an interesting icebreaker. I tried thinking about like more ethics-oriented kind of icebreakers, but like then I arrived at this, and I think this is like sort of a decent icebreaker. So let's start with Milo. What is the last good thing you did, and why did you do it?
I cooked a dinner for someone.
Oh.
Because I was trying to impress them. I thought good was in quotes for a reason.
No. Oh no, I mean like last. Oh yeah, I don't know why I put that in quotes. Oh well, like it's in quotes because it's like we'll talk about what goodness is later.
Okay, so actually like benevolence.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, actually, I mean, this is a great kind of thing. Like, do you genuinely think that was a good thing to have done?
Definitely.
All right, cool, interesting. Do we have differing opinions? Does anyone think that's like not good to like cook dinner for someone to impress them?
Yeah.
Okay, all right, interesting.
Because you're expecting, like, if it's good, you're not expecting something from it.
Right?
You have to do it out of your own.
Right? That's what I intuitively felt as well. Okay, Sid, your turn. What is the last good thing you
Yeah, can you like?
Okay, Shahzad.
I don't know.
What is the last good thing you did? You cannot remember a good thing you've done? You guys are just bad people?
Correct.
Does anyone have one? And then I can come back.
Okay. On Valentine's Day, my friends, we wanted to like do something nice, but 2 of my friends had like water polo, and my other friend, her like entire computer just like broke, so she was gonna get fixed. So I made everyone probably because somebody.
Wow. That is nice. That is a nice thing to do. Damn, throwing shade at my. Okay, Sid.
I helped raise funds for children.
Wow, when did you do that?
Last Friday.
Okay. Wait, weren't you obligated to do that as part of like civic chores?
I was free, so I went to help.
Oh, you did actually do that. Hey, and you covered that dude's KP a few weeks ago, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So Sid's a good person. Okay.
Yeah,
fair
actually,
enough.
Oh, me? That actually gets me to think. When's the last time I did something without expecting? Wait, okay, but for Valentine's Day, I gave like everyone I knew pretty much like Ferrero like those shares that I saw that day. Like I went to NTP and I bought a box and then like handing them out.
Wow, that is indeed a nice thing to do. Okay, Sid.
Oh, I gave a bunch of my friends chocolate.
Why is everyone saying the same thing? Like you cannot use Valentine's Day. Like, this is,
It wasn't for Valentine's Day.
randomly.
Basically, I live in Switzerland and I got back a bunch of chocolate,
okay.
but it was all expiring.
This was
is
last
not
semester.
No,
This was last
this is not
semester.
making me look good.
The last good thing you did was last semester, bro.
Yeah.
It's literally last
This
semester.
happened again on Friday.
Okay.
Basically, it expired. It was going to expire, and I had to give it. This is not making me look good.
Yo, what?
But I had to give a lot of like really high quality chocolate to a lot of people. And
Oh, you had to.
but I did it, and I
Okay.
didn't like, eat all of it. Okay, this is not good. Ishika.
Yeah, this is
Last
very.
good thing I did, I went to Target to buy you a COVID test because you thought you were dying.
Yeah.
You should do that.
Oh, respectable, Chris.
Okay, since I'm taking ethical theory, like, what I mean to like elaborate like on that.
Huh?
Like, okay, I'll just, okay, so, I'm at the foundation level, I'm a rational egoist, and at the factors level, I'm a modern day ontologist.
Okay.
So yesterday, my girlfriend was hospitalized and I visited her, but in order to do that, I had to like cancel a meeting with my advisor. So in terms of the overall goodness and outcomes, my advisor was kind of hurt because like I already missed the last meeting. But then the overall good that was produced was that I was able to spend time with my girlfriend, and that increased the welfare at a much larger rate. So in that sense, it was like the best. It was like the best action to perform.
Definitely a lot better than handing out expired chocolate. Okay, very, very respectful. I think we can all agree that that was an ethical decision. Shakti.
Yeah.
Last question I did.
The last good thing you did was asking that question. That was very wholesome. Wow.
Yeah, my roommate has been like, pretty unwell. She fell and like broke her tooth and like broke her face.
She broke her face?
And she broke her, like her tooth chipped and everything. Like she had some like, she had a concussion.
Oh,
Yeah, she's okay now, but I've been getting her like all. So I just, like,
yeah. Is she fine?
She's okay, yeah.
Okay.
How did that happen? Did she fall down?
Yeah, like she like slipped and she hit the pavement.
Oh my
She wasn't sober.
Definitely, we've had similar stuff. Like, you know, on the spin bikes, that will fuck you up. That will fuck you up.
Those are
What was the last good thing you did?
Wait.
Teaching this class.
Yeah, I'm teaching this class.
that's
Yeah.
not- I think you brought your laptop. I think that was a good.
What? My
Did you bring
life?
your own
I brought my own.
Time.
I brought my own HDMI thing. See, I allowed Shahzadi to keep her own HDMI
Wow.
connector. That was a pretty good thing, I think. Right. Okay. Okay. Wonderful. Okay. Question: what is ethics? So we've been talking about all these good things we've done, but how do we know it is a good thing? What does ethics actually define? What is ethics? Answer. Chris?
So ethics, otherwise known as like normative theory, is basically like trying to determine like so like there are like different levels. There's like there's like meta ethics, which is like discussing more like what is good and stuff like that. But then there's also like whether individual actions can be good, and there are like various theories that try to create like a framework for you to like decide like what actions you should do.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And I mean, there's like non-normative approaches to ethics, but like I'm not an expert at like Western categorization of ethical theory. But yeah, definitely. I think that's like a good way to put it, right? Like ethics sort of talks about like what actions are good. So like we use the word good all the time, right? We throw around good. That was a good thing to do. That was a bad thing to do. So ethics sort of like seeks to classify what is good and what is bad. And the few topics that we're covering today are all part of this field called axiology, which is like the study of value. So ethics studies like on a personal level, what actions are valuable. And then sociopolitics or political philosophy studies at a societal level, what kind of actions or structures are valuable. And then aesthetics studies something sort of hand wavy called like aesthetic value. So we'll cover that a bit at the end. But at the start, we're going to be talking about, for most of the class today, we're going to be talking about ethical value. So yeah, questions on how we define ethics or any of this sort of a value system idea. Okay. Okay. Cool. So first, let's take a look at an overview of like ethical literature. Also, the slides today are really short. Most of today is going to be like discussion. I'm pretty sure. Like I only have like 10 slides, less than 10 slides. So it should be pretty short for today. So ethical literature in India is like quite vast, just like in most traditional societies, right? In order for society to function, you have to have people more or less agreeing on like what is good, what is bad. You can't have a society where actually you sort of can. So there's like these weird anthropological studies of like societies where it's like normalized to like steal from other people, and like these things that we consider like really like out there, like there are actually like societies in some regions that do actually have it. But I guess the general idea is that like as a society generally we do need to agree on some common like set of cultural attributes that defines what is ethical behavior, like what is acceptable and what is not. So in India, the ethical literature goes back pretty far. We talked about the Vedic literature. What's up, Doug? We talked about the Vedic literature last time. That goes back to around 1500 BC. Around that period, we have the Samhita literature, right? But we also but that literature doesn't really explicitly define ethics. So around here, we have like 1500, let's say like 1500. Let's say 0, and then let's say 2000. I've drawn this sort of chart like innumerable times now. I think I should just like leave it on the board because like it's sort of, if you think about it, like we're just looking at history from all these different perspectives. So again, 1500 around this period to like -1000. We don't really seem to have too much ethical literature, at least explicitly. We have these stories of like gods like doing things and like them being like praised for it, and like other like when someone is praising someone, when someone is praising some actions, you'd assume that like the society considers that like an ethical action. So we at least have that. But then in this period over here, we have a lot of what is called Brahminical literature, and these are basically texts that define correct ritual action, and they basically become appended to these samhitas. So we have the samhitas over here, and then we have the brahmanas over here. These start like, so these are very arcane. We looked at some like riddle poetry last class, right? So the brahmanas really seek to like interpret these and like provide actual like meaningful prescriptions on how these rituals should be completed. So this is sort of like the first ethical literature in a sense that like these rituals are taken as like the basis for like what a person, like a religious, like ethically, morally upstanding person should do in the society. But at the same time, obviously ethics isn't just like these religious rituals, right? It also applies to like other things in like general like society, right? Like is it okay to steal? Is it okay to have adulterous relationships, right? Things start getting blurry. So that's where we need these kind of ethical literature to start stepping in and like prescribing what is okay and what is not. So around this period, we have the DharmaSutra literature. So there's 4 extant Dharmasutras. So these are collections of text in the sutranic form, right? Which is basically where we have these long lists, right? And then we sort of like string on these short, very concise kind of utterances that sort of formulaically define some property or idea. And the reason it's called a sutra literally means a string, is because these phrases are like strung onto this long sutra, at least metaphorically. So then after these Dharma Sutra, or any questions up till this point about the sutra form and Dharma Sutra literature? Okay, cool. So there's sort of a bit of internal inconsistency between some of these Dharma Sutras, but largely they agree on the general kind of ethical prescriptions. So I'll put like this, and then after this, we start to see what are called the DharmaShastras, and these are in approximately this period. Yeah, something like this. So we have the DharmaShastras. So around this period, we see a switch from sutranic literature to this shastric literature. So instead of writing in this sutranic form, we instead have these shlokas. So shlokas are a poetic form where we have 16 syllables. We have basically 8, 8, 8, 8. It's like in total, it's 32 syllables, right? So we have the first line that's 16 syllables, and the second line that's another 16 syllables. So it's just like a different like literary way of composing, like a different poetic style of composing this literature. And the most famous kind of Dharmashastra is the Manusmriti, that's from around like 200-ish BC. And that's sort of what the British eventually used to define the laws of their British India for the Hindus, right? So when the Mughals during the Mughal Empire, we had this system where there were explicitly like defined rules for Muslims based on like Sharia law, but then for the native Hindus and like the other populations, it wasn't exactly clear what kind of laws were to be applied to them because they were entirely different religions. So like, what are their ethics, right? So when the British arrived, they were like, okay, we need different rules for different religious groups. So we'll look to the Manusmriti, which is this own book of the Hindus, and use that to define their own laws for them. And obviously, there's a lot of questions around how correctly interpreted these rules are, and to what extent there was like colonial imperialism going on, but we'll leave that discussion for later today. One of the interesting kind of things and sort of foundational things that these texts discuss is sources of ethical knowledge, right? So we can talk about like specific ethical situations, right? Like was it ethical for Milo to what did Milo do again? Oh yeah, like impress someone by cooking. That's like a specific kind of situation. And we might not, there's like different ways we could know whether that's like actually ethical or not, right? So we have to sort of, what this literature basically says is that we have to go down this hierarchy of sources of ethical knowledge. So the first source of ethical knowledge, they say, is the Veda or the Shruti. So this is basically this section of literature that it says that this is like the preliminary source that you have to go to decide whether something is ethical or not. Chris, was that a question, I think? Okay. So if these texts don't have anything to say, right, and they probably don't have anything about whether Milo cooking to impress someone is ethical or not, there's probably nowhere in here you could go up, look up something where it explicitly says, if you cook a food to impress someone, you shall forever never get moksha, you will be banned to this karmic existence forever. Like, it probably doesn't say that anywhere here. So then the next source we have to go to is the Smriti. So the Smriti is the traditional literature that we actually see, that we believe are composed by humans. So the sort of like literary divide always in Indian literature is between the Shruti and the Smriti. So the Shruti literally means that which is heard. The Smriti means that which is remembered. So the Shruti usually refers to the Vedic corpus, and then the Smriti refers to basically everything else, everything that was like written down and like we believe to be composed by humans. Whereas the Shruti we believe are to be like divinely revealed kind of documents. So again, the DharmaSutras probably don't say anything explicit about this, though I imagine the Kamasutras might actually discuss like what Milo actually did. You know, there's actually a section in the Kamasutra, we didn't talk about it last class, like a couple of classes ago or whatever that was. But it says something like, if there's like a girl you are trying to impress, like invite her to a dinner party and then like play like this game of poetry, and like everyone has to like fill in these like poems. And then like you have to like write like a suggestive poem for her and then like let her fill it in. Like that's like how you should like impress this girl. Like there's actually this section in the Kama Sutra. So like what Milo did might like, it doesn't sound too far-fetched. But I don't think what they're referring to here in terms of Smriti literature, I don't think that they'd comment on this exact situation. So then what we'd have to go to is good custom, Shishtachara, which means what is like the tradition of the good people, people who are like well versed in literature and like good culture and ethics. We have to go look to them. So Milo, that basically means that Milo would have to go to some like morally upstanding people and be like, do they make food to impress people? Do they do that? If they do, then it's morally acceptable. Otherwise, it's not. So like, who are some morally upstanding people you can think of that we can like ask to determine this? Who are morally upstanding people?
Universally or like an individual?
Anywhere. I mean, like even like you don't have to personally know them.
You must be morally obsessed.
I don't know about that
Teaching
one.
in quotes is like philosophy.
Maybe. You don't have to personally know these people though. I mean, who do you think is morally upstanding? Morally upstanding people. It could be like famous people. The Dalai Lama, yeah. He probably seems pretty morally upstanding. Jesus, yeah, probably Jesus. Anyone else that yes, Sid?
You just think.
Okay, any other thoughts? Any other thoughts? Morally upstanding individuals.
Bernie Sanders.
Bernie Sanders, maybe. I mean, there's definitely a lot of people that would disagree, but yeah, could be a lot of people. So that's the question then. Does Bernie Sanders cook food to impress people? Do you think he does, Lila? How do you know?
No, we don't know.
We don't know, right? We don't know. So then what the literature says then, since we're unable to determine from all these good people whether this is an ethical choice or not, now we're going to have to go to something they called Atma Tushti, which means inner contentment. Whether the soul agrees with it. This doesn't mean, does it bring me pleasure? It isn't like pleasure of the soul or pleasure of the self. It instead means this like contentment. Does this feel morally right, basically? Is like intuitively, does this seem like something that I should do? I am happy doing, I'm happy with society doing. A lot more hand wavy. So ultimately we have to go to the source for that. Milo, are you content with your actions?
I'm very.
Okay, so then I guess it is ethical, guys. I guess it's ethical. Then. Damn. So I mean, that's the sort of epistemological process that these ethical literature would sort of suggest. We go down this chain, and ultimately we arrive at the answer at one point or another. Cool. Any questions on this? Yeah.
Isn't it like a bit strange that like inner contentment is lost? Like I feel like if anything it should be higher up on the hierarchy, right? Like it's not like the first point of contact. When you do something, you instantly just like start like processing what you've done, right? Like evaluating. It's like just strange that it's like the last. You do everything else and then you think to yourself.
Maybe any differing opinions? Milo, is that a differing opinion or yeah?
I'm sure some people who truly believe it's a very evil thing,
Right.
are very content with themselves.
Yeah.
Like I'm sure like some psychopath see that like, like loves to do it, feels content with it, like, or something that's stronger.
Mhm.
It's also like it must be like your like perception of contentment must be like a combination of the top three though, right? Like how can you evaluate your own action in isolation? Like for example, the dinner thing. Then like I might like, I would have seen, I don't know, my dad make dinner with my mom and I thought that was good. And I'm like, I've internalized that and that could be like interpreting as tradition. So I feel like those three directly feed into the fourth,
Definitely, yeah. Any other thoughts on that? Yeah.
This is gonna sound bad, so literally just tell me to shut up. If it gets, okay, so my friends in high school and I were talking about like, as you were saying, like when serial killers or people who are like actually terrible, like if they die like happy with their actions, then we were specifically talking about Hitler. As you do.
Okay.
No,
Yeah. No, that's like what popped into my mind as well. Like, yeah.
Like, I mean, he thought he was like making a better race or a better country. So like, yeah, it's kind of weird that as you say, not why that is the last thing you go through.
No. I mean, like, isn't Hitler evidence that it should be the
Yeah.
last thing to go to, right?
Yeah, I feel like Hitler and psychopaths in general, and like that justifies to me why that should be the last. Like if Hitler would have gone to literally made that tradition all good custom, he would have been like shit. And nobody else wants to kill like millions of people.
But also, what about religious texts where they actively tell you that things that you might deem or that you might personally disagree with are good things to do? So then do you follow that or do you follow like what you believe is good?
Definitely. I think there's a case to be made for interpretation, right? So there's always a lot of like fuzziness in interpretation. And when you're looking at like at least traditional literature, like the Smriti, I think there's a lot more room for being able to say this was like a misinterpretation of like the actual like intended kind of ideas here. But with this, I think that someone traditionally versed in ethical doctrine would say that if you were interpreting this correct, there is like no room for like ethical fuzziness. Like what this says is like objectively true from like within this like traditional Vedic standpoint. I don't know. Could you think of like examples of religious doctrines that you personally would feel like ethically discontent with?
Like,
I'm not sure.
there's like, I mean, in Hinduism at least, there's so many, like, Hinduism as a religion has a lot of advantages, but like, it kind of like postulates the caste system, right? Like, it kind of thrives on it, and like, especially more ancient versions of it.
Yeah, no, we're gonna get that
We're
into
like,
that later.
we're
Yeah, yeah.
really, we're like kind of
Are we
religion.
talking about like modern Hinduism or like literally?
Oh, even okay, if we partake in Hinduism to be like the 1800s or something, like Sati was like still around, right? And that was kind of universally accepted not to
Definitely,
be horrible. So I feel like I don't know, like Hinduism is kind of interesting in this like hierarchy of knowledge, because I feel like Hinduism as a religion, this might be like completely wrong, but it was kind of created to like enforce like a sense of science. Like a lot of like Hindu principles, I feel like a lot of religious principles in general. This is like tangent. I feel like a lot of religious principles like enforce some degree of like basic science, and religion was kind of a way of like, I don't know, like diffusing that knowledge without like explicitly teaching it, because that would be like too heavy. Like for example, in Christianity, sorry, like there's like Lent, right?
Yeah.
And Hinduism, there's there's certain periods of time where you should fast, and that is the same period of time where like crops and meat, meat is supposed to be bad. So there's like really strong scientific basis to so many things. I feel like there are those advantages, and that's why it makes sense to me why like things like Veda and tradition should be directly related to so high. But like also like Hinduism, and I'm sure some other religions are like have like kind of horrible things in them as well. That's kind of scary as well that they're so high, because like, for example, with Sati, if I like agreed with it, if I was like crazy, and I looked at like Hinduism in the 1800s, it would be like, you're right. You should like your wife should die if you do.
Yeah, no, and definitely, I think like what is required then is like an actual analysis of these texts, and like to question like, is sati something that actually appears in this literature? And like for the most part, it doesn't seem to. Sati is actually largely something that arose in the 1100s and 1200s in Western and like Northwestern India, with the rise of Muslim migrations into the Northwest. So it's not actually something that was historically a part of the Smriti tradition, at least as far as I know. I haven't come across it, and I've seen certain papers that go into like researching like the historical basis for sati, and there doesn't seem to be much evidence for it before 900, 1000 AD.
You know, like the novelty in that whole saga came about, because that was like the
Which?
about sati. You know the movie
Malati.
Malati. And there was the, have you like
No.
Okay. It's not like Deepika Malati, it was like
Okay.
really big.
I think.
Oh yeah, okay. Basically there was like a very big Bollywood dramatization.
Okay.
And like it was a huge thing in India. Like everyone was like angry about it, because like it was like right.
The princess in the wrong.
Basically like
She's seen as like a deity.
yeah, exactly.
In like one sect of
And there were like riots and everything. And it was like it was released at a point where like religious tensions were just being ignited. Like the prime minister had just started his kind of like descent into slightly more divisive policy. So like that was just like this.
Yeah, no, interesting. I mean, there's definitely like scenes in what we think are ancient Hinduism of sati, right? Like these Puranic stories of like the actual like goddess sati, right? Like jumping into the fire and everything. But it turns out these are all Puranic stories, and the Puranas are composed basically in this period. There's a small overlap with Smriti literature, but Smriti literature again is like largely condensed over here. So it seems to be the case that like a lot of these Puranic stories are probably not in line with what we'd consider like epistemological sources of ethical knowledge in traditional like Vedic thought. But we're definitely going to get into caste, because that is a lot more complicated with caste. So we're getting into that later today. Yeah. Does someone want to provide context for that? Yeah.
basically it was like a tradition closely associated with Hinduism, where if you were married, and your husband, assuming your wife, your husband died, you would have to like commit suicide. And it was kind of weaponized by the British post their departure from India, because it was like one of the good things the British did, right? They abolished sati. And like it kind of helped make the narrative that colonization was like had advantages and was good, right? And there were like three components to the argument. One was like the abolishment of sati, one was like the railways, and the third was like I think unification of it, something like that. And like all three of those arguments could be like heavily disputed because the British were just like saying shit, right? But anyway, so there's something else.
Definitely. Yeah, no. And then you had said something earlier about how like the first three here like influence the last. Definitely, I think like, yeah, you're right? Like all these kind of societal implications are sort of trained into our subconscious as we grow up. And that's sort of what creates this sense of like inner contentment in the first place. Cool. All right. So here's like an interesting kind of quote from sort of the authoritative like English language textbook on like traditional Hindu ethics. Here, what it's basically saying is that there's this thing called a Buttershad, which is basically a gathering of knowledgeable people to basically decide on whether something is ethical or not. Not too different from like a modern like judicial court. And here we have like an interesting kind of quote that's sort of like tying together a lot of these questions about like caste and like ethical knowledge. So the Bauddhayana DharmaSutra, which is from like around this period, it basically says with respect to this Buttershad, this assembly of knowledgeable people, they can be 5, they can be 3. One man without sin is sufficient to decide on the rule, but 1,000 fools would be incompetent to do it. As an elephant made of wood, as an antelope made of leather, so is an ignorant Brahmin. Like them, he is nothing more than the name of his species. The Manusmriti says that that which even a single Brahmin instructed in the Veda declares to be dharma must be considered as the highest rule, and not whatever may be proclaimed by myriads of ignorant men. Even thousands of Brahmins, if they have not fulfilled their religious duties, if they're not well versed, if they're not knowledgeable, blah, 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 are merely subsisting upon the names of their caste, are incompetent to constitute a parishad by assembling together. So like here's basically saying that like the like very early on, right, in this period, or like before the Guptas, before all of this, we see these traditional kind of Smriti texts basically saying that like caste is some like Brahminical caste is something deeply intertwined with actually having knowledge of like ethical literature, and like being well versed in the Veda, etc. It's not something that is genetically bestowed upon someone. And at the same time, it's making this argument that ethical knowledge comes not from social consensus, not from like democracy, right? 1,000 fools aren't good enough to decide what is ethical, but a small group of people who are well studied in ethics are perfectly fine to decide what is ethical. So we'll talk a bit more about democracy, but like any thoughts on this quote or the ideas posed here? Do you think it's right? Do you think it's true that 1,000 people, 1,000 people from like the general populace are less ethically, are a less valuable ethical source than like 3 people who are knowledgeable? Yeah, Chris?
Well, I personally think ethics is like completely subjective. So like it might be the case that like those 1,000 people might like their like agreement on like what constitutes as ethical might like agree with general populace. Like I still think that that's not something that they should force upon others. Like everyone should be able to come up with like their own idea of ethics and like their own decision.
Very interesting. John?
I was gonna say like kind of similar, just like when you have a lot of people, you're like more diverse like viewpoints, I suppose. And it's hard to like really ensure that like in the, I guess if you're relying on one person, like you assume that they're like almost perfect in a sense. And like I don't know how, like you can't really ensure that. And so it's hard to like, and like we were talking about those 4 like things, and it's like at that point, is their soul like content with like, the right thing to kind of
I mean, to give a concrete example that's sort of differing from this, we have like in the West, right? We have like the Supreme Court of like 9 people who we consider to be like very well versed in the Constitution and like traditional Enlightenment ethics, etc. And when there's any like significant case that we can't just agree with on any other level, we ultimately consult to them, right? And they're sort of like the ultimate arbiters of like what is right, what is constitutional, and what isn't. So let that become part of this dialogue as well. Yashka.
I was thinking of it more in terms of the fact that you shouldn't make decisions unless you're fully informed, regardless of what that decision might be about, right? Because it says even thousands of Brahmins, if they have not fulfilled their religious duties, are like incompetent, which basically means that like even if you have the name, even if you're part of like so-called Supreme Court, if you simply don't have the knowledge, then you're not competent to make any decision.
Yeah.
And so I don't know, I'm just looking at it like more in that terms rather than like democracy or whatever. It's more like regardless of who you are, you need to have knowledge before you make a decision.
Definitely, right? And I mean, I think in A-Push, at least when I was in A-Push, like we had this discussion of like, yeah, AP US history for those of you, but we had this discussion of like whether people should be allowed to vote if they weren't like well versed in like the actual like ideas that they were voting on. So I think it's sort of like a similar question here, right? I mean, yeah.
I was thinking like, I feel like it sort of sets up this dichotomy between educated or uneducated and sort of distracts from like, why does that split exist in the first place? And it tends to be like the upper classes or what, however the society is set up, keeping education away from the majority, the masses. And if everyone like in a hypothetical like perfect world or whatever, everyone would have access, like equal access and opportunity to get this information. And then adding on to the Supreme Court example, actually in business ethics class, I think the professor was talking about how very often the Supreme Court isn't like this very highly skilled, highly versed in the law. Some of them can be, of course, but a lot of the times it's used as like a political tool to like seize whatever president is at the moment, like what their agenda is.
Definitely, yeah. I mean, I think on the first point, like, you're right. Oh, here's something I'll bring up, right? Someone who, like, Hitler, right? So Hitler's like ethical opinions, right? Even if we educated Hitler, we threw 1,000 books at him and we're like, read all of this literature about constitutionalism and like being a good person, like would that fundamentally change Hitler's opinions on like what we should do about the Jews, right? Like would he have like decided to not Holocaust 6 million people, 12 million people?
I guess it's hard. I don't know how exactly Hitler was radicalized to such an extent. Like he started off like an artist, and then he was in a city that was very anti-Semitic, and he was fell into some hard times or whatever. I don't know like what exactly happened. I don't know what happens to anyone that makes them want to commit like genocide. Sorry, but yeah, it's hard. It's like when should the education start, and like when is it too late to change anything?
Yeah. Okay. Yashika.
I'm gonna disagree with what I said earlier.
Okay.
I mean, what I said is that you shouldn't make like decisions unless you're educated, but with the points being brought up, isn't like there's different kinds of education, right? Like someone who has read like a crap ton of books would not necessarily know how to farm in the most optimized way. The same way that someone who might know how to farm in the most optimized way, like might not know that much about law and order and justice or whatever. And so like, I don't know, just throwing that out there, I guess.
Like education by itself is not sufficient, right? Like someone also has to have like the reasoning ability and like the correct education in order to make relevant
And
decisions.
there's no one definition to what's like who's educated and who's not.
Yeah, definitely. Were you gonna say something?
I want to say like 2 things. First, I was like reading a really interesting study about how like we keep talking about how important education is, but like sometimes we fail to consider that like voting and seeing the impact of your vote is a form of education in itself, right? Like for example, if policy, for example, my parents, I don't know, voted for Modi like 2015, and now they're like shit, right? And now they've been educated, right? So like like there's a form of education happening within voting itself,
Yeah.
and like stating that you should be educated to vote, you're kind of limiting that education to take place. That could be an interesting perspective. And the second thing I wanted to bring up was like this kind of stands like a little bit to me as an opposition to democracy.
Mhm.
And like that thought was actually like shared by so many different philosophers. So like Plato, for example,
Yeah. The
Plato, like,
Republic. Yeah.
hated democracy, right? He said it was the worst. And like his three key reasons were all distilled into like it will be ruled by the young because like ancient Greek had very low life expectancy and everyone was young. And then it'd be ruled by like the reckless, because like young men usually drank a lot of wine in Greece. This is like literally he was like they'll all be alcoholics and they'll be young and they'll be horrible if we give them like a. And then the third and the most important thing was it'll be ruled by the ignorant. Like Plato was like we can never have democracy because it will be ruling by like people who don't know anything. Because,
Exactly.
Ancient Greece, like ancient cultures in general, were pretty rudimentary. So I don't know. I like this kind of stands to me like instantly like I related to that thing about like what Plato was saying, and it's kind of interesting how this was I guess completely different paradigm of philosophy, but they kind of like share their similar thoughts.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of similarities between like Platonic thought and like Indian philosophy, right? Even in Plato's Republic, he has this idea where you have like the philosopher king who's like well versed in philosophy, but he also rules, and then you have like the
Just him basically.
yeah, basically him. Like, I should rule. And then he has like this like genetically bred caste of like or class of like soldiers who protect the philosopher king, and like they like confiscate the youth from the rest of the people, and like train the relevant ones to like, and like if you think about it, it'll like this is literally Plato in like 500 BC, and like in a lot of ways like that seems to sort of be what the caste system ended up being, right? So like there's a lot of similarities definitely between like Greek thought and like what happened in ancient India, and it's crazy that like a lot of philosophers will be like, yeah, Plato, like he was like a great guy. Like I respect Plato's ideas, but then like you see this and it's like, wait, what?
Like,
So-
like it was crazy to some extent.
Yeah. It was pretty wild. But it also makes you like question like if our entire intellectual culture is like based on this, maybe like to what extent is there merit about like the idea that like the fundamental ideas he was talking about, right? Because we're entrenched in this culture that tells us democracy is good, like everyone should have a vote, everyone should have an opinion. But if you really think about it, right, if you have like this intuitively makes sense in the sense that if you have 1,000 fools and you have one person who's like completely well versed in like ethical knowledge, etc., like whose opinion are you going to take more seriously? So there's like an intuition on both sides, and I think we sort of need to realize that like democracy need not be inherently good in and of itself. Yeah.
This is also like a bit of tangent, but I was like reading this article about like how we don't give, okay, it's gonna sound horrible, we don't give merits to like totalitarianism. Like if you look at like the most, I'm not like
No, I think it's good to play devil's
like the most successful and the most like rapidly developing societies. And there was a very good case study about this. Post-colonization, India, China, Singapore all came out together. Like the 1940s, 1950s, they were all very poor. They were all new countries, new democracies, right? Yet tiger economies, specifically China, Singapore, like that area in general, have far surpassed India in like every development indicator. And like the key difference there can be distilled that India like prioritized democracy.
Yeah.
India was like, we're going to be the world's largest democracy. China went another route, and then Singapore had a blend, but it was mainly run
like
by
state national, like state capitalism.
and like Singapore was like its own discussion to its time, right?
Yeah.
But in general, like there's like a very strong case that could be made that like a lot more people are living like vastly better lives because there were a few like overarching decisions made by like a sole
Highly
person,
educated. Yeah, exactly.
by like one essentially dictator, right?
Yeah.
So that kind of ties me to this. Maybe they had a point because like there's a very tangible difference in development between those two systems that arose. But then of course like the like extension of that is the difference between economic growth and development. So economic growth is defined as a real increase in GDP. That's it. And then economic development on the other hand is like 500 things. It's like freedom.
Yeah,
of
human
expression.
development index.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's like it's much more like ambiguous. So like if you start looking at dictatorships, you realize that okay, like great for economic growth, but on economic development, how good are they, right?
Yeah.
Freedom of press is not that good. Maybe people are generally unhappy. It's like the discussion that kind of spurs on. But it's interesting. Maybe this had a point, and like we don't know yet.
Yeah. No, there's definitely a lot of factors, but I think we're definitely like American youth were definitely oversold on democracy and like liberty, etc. Okay, let's jump to Mimamsa. So this is a school of philosophy that probably has its roots in somewhere around here. Like its intellectual, its cultural roots go back to here. They're like the strictest adherence to like Vedic religion, but their intellectual roots seem to be around this period, maybe 400, 500 BC. They're a school of philosophy that basically focused on literary analysis, interpretation, and exegesis. I'm not sure whether it's exegesis or exegesis. Do we have an opinion here? Has anyone heard this word aloud? Okay, I've only ever read it. I'm going to say exegesis. Okay, so basically what that means is like, how do we go from these texts, right? How do we go from these texts? How do we go from those to actual actionable kind of things that we can do? They like formalized and like standardized this approach to taking a traditional text and making an ethical decision from it. So here is like a few of their like most relevant sutras. This is from something called the Purva Mimamsa Sutra, which is like the authoritative text on Mimamsa. As we'll see next week, each philosophical school had its own set of sutras that like were sort of like the foundational kind of ideas, and then everyone else basically referred to that and wrote these kind of commentaries on it to expand the basic ideas there. So this first sutra basically says that cognition by a person which appears when there is contact of the sense organs is sense perception, and it is not a means of knowing dharma as it apprehends only things existing at the present time. Basically, this is like a fundamental like epistemological statement. He's saying, or like the sutra says that when we observe something in the real world, when we have perception of something, that perception only perceives that which is vidyamana, which is translated here as like that which is present, existing at the present time. The actual translation there is a lot more complicated, and it's the topic of a lot of later commentaries. But the general idea is that like since our perception can only apprehend that which is like present right in front of us, that prevents us from understanding ethics, right? Ethics is about what should be done. It's not about what is actually there or what exists or what we can observe. It's about what must be done, what we should do. And they basically say that they take as like a foundational axiom that since perception only allows us to see what there is, it doesn't allow us to see what there should be, and therefore is basically irrelevant. Perception is basically irrelevant as a source of knowledge on what we should do. Here's like another kind of like random sutra I pulled out that sort of talks about like sort of like a good example of their like literary technique. When a certain expression can be rightly taken in its own context, it is not right to transfer it elsewhere, especially as an injunction would have no use with regards to that particular sacrifice. So the idea here is that like the details don't matter. What they're basically saying is that like if you can interpret an expression like where it is, then we shouldn't go and apply that expression to other places where it doesn't make sense. And the way the Mimamsa school developed is that originally it was applied to these texts, which are like more so focused on like rituals and like traditional like religious ideas. But eventually the Mimamsa school became their techniques became applied to like all sorts of literature. So they started applying them to these, and that's what eventually allows you to very rigorously identify like what should be done based on these texts. So Mimamsa becomes generalized as like a very formal way to make this ethical decision making. Cool. Questions on Mimamsa? All right, cool. They also have a lot of very interesting like philosophy of language stuff that we'll probably talk in a few weeks. But yeah, very, very, I like them a lot. Okay, Purushartha theory. So this is probably like, has anyone heard of this? Like Dharma, Artha, Kama? Like have your parents talked about this? Yeah, okay, maybe. Basically, this is like a traditional kind of like common approach to ethics in Indian philosophy. it probably has its basis somewhere around here. Like I think you can probably find the original attestations of these ideas in the Brahmanas. The general idea is that there's like three goals of human life. The first is like, or like not necessarily ordered, but like sort of ordered. Like some people order them, some people just say it's like a set of like obligations. The first is dharma, right, which is duty. That's like what all of the rest of the stuff we've been talking about so far focuses on mainly. Like how do we go about doing that which is like expected of us as like members of society, as like humans, as ethical beings, that which is dutiful, right? And then there's artha, so wealth or means, like how do we go about like providing for ourselves and providing for a community in the form of like money or economic value. And then there's kama, which is pleasure. So like how do we bring like enjoyment to our lives? That's like also another important component of like living. Then there's the stages of life, right? So there's brahmacharya, which is like being a student. So that's like age 0 to 25. When you focus entirely on just like your studies, etc. Then there's the grihastha phase, which is when you're a householder from like 25 to 50. You raise kids, you make money, etc. And then there's the vanaprastha phase, which is when you basically go into retirement. It literally means like when you become a forest dweller. And this is when people start getting ready to like die and like pass their family on, like their possessions on to the next generation. Questions on this? Yeah.
So like towards the end of life, do they make the old people dwell in the forest?
No, so like if we actually look at, like I was reading about this yesterday, if we actually look at traditional sources, it doesn't seem like this ever really happened. Like no one really just like moved to the forest. They did like tend to like move out of their house, so they no longer were like house dwellers. Like I guess you can sort of think about it more like a like it's sort of metaphorical, right? Like rather than living in this like house and like focusing on like your social duties, etc., you sort of like turn inwards and like start focusing on like the forest that is life, you know, like in some metaphorical sense. But like I'm sure some certainly did, and like in the Mahabharata we have stories of people who become old and then they move out into like literally to become forest dwellers.
Where do they move out? Like do they become homeless?
Yeah, but I mean, like when you're in a tropical country, right? Like you're literally like forest. There's like fruits everywhere, right? Like you just like wander around and just like eat fruits, just like vibe. Like actually, this is something we can talk about too. Like no, like literally, like when I went to Hawaii last time, I was like, the weather is so nice here. Like you could literally be homeless and just vibe, like just like live on the beach and like eat mangoes.
Trevor Noah, I think he was like, have you noticed all colonizers are from places with shit weather?
Oh my God,
It's so facts. Like why didn't everyone like Caribbean colonize? Like why would you ever leave?
No, and the
Like,
flip
their weather rocks.
the flip side of this is like this white nationalist argument, which basically says that like regions with cold climates like force you to have like higher IQs because you like the poor people and the homeless people basically die off. So like every winter it like kills off the homeless people, whereas in tropical countries like they're allowed to survive.
Like rapid natural selection.
Yeah, exactly. Like it makes Darwinism faster.
Yeah,
So like
exactly.
I don't know. It intuitively makes sense, but I've not seen like empirical data backing it up. But yeah,
Conduct like a 3,000-year-long question.
just throw some people into Siberia and like some into Hawaii and see who's smarter at the end. Yeah, no, it could be interesting. I mean, yeah, we can talk about that too. But yeah, were there any other thoughts on this?
My sister's like 25, and she just turned 25, and when she turned 25, she ate like her like head exploded, and she was like, I had like a midlife crisis. She's like, she was like 2 years into a job. She's like, I'm so old. And then like this winter, actually, we were like talking over like my family stuff, and then my parents like brought this up. Like my sister was like to my dad, my mom like, how do you guys don't have midlife crisis? You're really old. And then my dad was like, no, but like in Hinduism or like in the Indian philosophy, there's like there's like a lot of people, including like my parents, they take a lot of comfort in like these segments of their life. They're like, no, this is what I'm supposed to do. Like 0 to like 25, like I was supposed to study and I did. Then 25 to 50, I'm working, I'm supporting my family, and I'm doing that. And then when I turn 50 or like 75 or whatever, I can just like, you know, genuinely like prepare to like, you know, to that. And And my dad said, I'm like, dude, what? Like, can you stop like saying things like this? It was like terrifying. And then even my sister was like, this is not helping. But what I'm trying to like say is that like these stages, like, I don't know, it's just interesting that they genuinely like help people like, wrap their head around like aging and like growing old.
Yeah, no, and I think that's like what a lot of these like traditional kind of doctrines are supposed to be, right? They provide sort of this framework. I think in like Western society, we've sort of gotten like so obsessed with this idea of like individualism and like freedom that we just sort of like cast everything aside and we're like, I can like define like how I want to live my life for myself. And like, sure, like you can, but like the percentage of people for who that is like more fulfilling than a lifestyle built around like certain like frameworks that are like provided historically. I think it's not as fulfilling necessarily. Sort of having this like framework to build your life around can very often be like, it can provide a sense of grounding in reality. Any other thoughts on this? Cool. Okay, moksha. So very often to this list of 3, there's a 4th added, moksha, which is basically this idea of like spiritual release. All these are sort of like these material or societal kind of duties. And moksha, on the other hand, is like spiritual. It's a spiritual kind of goal of all humans. And this is what the Upanishads are obsessed with. So the Upanishads are like around this period, basically. The Upanishads are obsessed, like we talked about this last week a bit, but they have this huge obsession with this sense of self, right? Brahman, like this all-pervading kind of creational energy and consciousness, right? So like realizing that like our consciousness like constructs all of reality, everything is like one with this grand energy. So moksha is sort of this idea that like we can become free from like the material attachments of the world and become like one with Brahman. So this was actually added later on. Originally during the like these Brahmanas, we see only this Trivarga mentioned, and then later on we have this ideal of moksha being professed in honestly not as late as this period. So the DharmaShastras actually, we saw a list of the DharmaShastras earlier. It's not until the Vishnu DharmaShastra which is around 700 AD. It's not until then that we actually see DharmaShastras talking about moksha. So it actually seems to have become a common like sociologically accepted component of ethics until quite late. And to this list of 3 stages of life, they add another one called sannyasin, which is when you become like not just like a vanaprastha, you don't just become someone wandering in the forest, you become someone who like completely abandons all material attachments. So like even like eating and like enjoying your life in the forest, like you're not like in the forest vibing with like fruits and stuff. You're like in the forest and you're like not experiencing anything. So I mean, like it doesn't sound too fun, but like supposedly it's good. Okay, cool. Quick question. Okay, yeah. Wait, how many more slides do you have after this? Okay, yeah, cool. So it's like 2 slides after this. Okay, what makes an ethical society? Question 1. What makes an ethical society? Or honestly, if so, wait, Chris, was that?
Yeah, sure. So I think we talked about this more in my ethical theory class. Like it's like when I won't describe it as like a utopia because that's like like you have a lot of radical ways to get there, but like it's like when everyone is basically just acting like the best they possibly can. So like you don't have like some random like Jeff Bezos contributing like this insane amount of like thing while like other people starve. It's like everyone contributes like not like equal amounts, I guess, but like as much as they can, right? Like as much as they're capable of, and like that produces a society where like other people are supporting you. You don't have to like feel like you have to like contribute more than other people. So like
Yeah, that's an interesting ethical ideal or a societal ideal. Yeah, Milo?
I mean, like, is this asking what I believe an ethical society is or what an ethical society is?
I mean, is there a difference?
I think there is, because like my rebuttal to what you just said would be like, like, yeah, sure, like I might agree with you, I might not agree with you, but like ultimately that's what your own ideals and ethics tell you in that society is. Like I haven't like studied this at all, but like my gut tells me that an ethical society would be a society in which everyone is content with what is happening to them, regardless of that being them being homeless or them having
equal amount of money or then X or Y, where everyone was content with the set of rules that set out and agreed to.
That is also an interesting societal ideal. Yeah.
So I feel like that degree of contentment is different for different people, right?
Yeah.
So like, for example, if you're homeless, like having a dry floor to sleep on, you're content, right? And then that will change again. Then you'll want a house and so on and so forth. So I feel like if we place the idea of an ethical society on something like contentment, it's like, okay, but when will everybody ever stop being content? We'll just like, I guess the human tendency of greed will just like take over until everyone's just like exposed. I don't know. So like I feel like this question is particularly difficult because every single answer is going to be based on something subjective, and we'll like never concretize it. But maybe an interesting perspective could be a society in which everybody's like basic needs are fulfilled. I feel like that's not a bad place to start because like basic needs being clothes, water, shelter, right? Like food, water, shelter. And like I feel like if at least those three are fulfilled, I feel like that can provide some sense of satisfaction to the society.
Interesting. Milo.
I think we're confounding the idea of like ethical society and like I don't know, maybe fair, like an adequate functional society, right? Like I don't like sure, well I agree like that's totally like what a functional society for me for. Like it doesn't have any rules or like ideas not as in like I'm saying like there must be laws for society. I'm saying like, oh like that doesn't really have a guideline for like what is the standard if somebody like attacks me in the street or if I like somebody tries to steal my stuff, right? Like what do you do in that case? Like I feel like well that's true for like functional society. I don't think we should functional.
That's fair. And I feel like that like is an important distinction, and that ties to like what we were talking about earlier with like the purpose of religion. Like a lot of people say that, like I said, like religion was created to like make people have morals, like on a mass scale. Like you know, like the Bible says certain things that you know very like generally can be interpreted as certain morals or the like religious texts in general. So I feel like I don't know, maybe ethics is in some way directly connected to religion. Maybe not as much anymore. Definitely not as much anymore. But at least in like ancient society, I feel like that link is kind of disputed.
I don't want this to become a back and forth, but Milo, wait, any other opinions first? Okay, Milo.
Yeah, I mean, I do agree with that. I was actually thinking about like religion. Well, that was one of the things that led me to where everybody agrees on a certain set of like whatever, right? Where agreement is the most important part. Because I figure like, oh, say there's some like society that I like don't believe in that follows some like crazy religion that like says you can do all these things, or like you might be super poor, you might be super rich, but you'll like if you follow these rules, you'll end up happy, and everybody totally believes that. Everybody's super content with their life because they believe like once they go through life, no matter how like suck it might be, like fine, right? Then like sure, maybe that's an ethical society because everybody's content, like even though they might be living like pretty bad life, maybe that's ethical, like.
Very interesting. Yeah. I think I'm going to very strongly disagree with the idea that contentment is an important component of ethical society. I think contentment is something that is like sort of a side effect, right? If you have an ethical society, people tend to be content. But I think what Milo said, or wait, was it someone said earlier that contentment is like never fulfilled, right? I think that's definitely true, right? Like people, like it is possible to through very strong kind of like meditative means get to a state where you have no desires. But for the most part, people's contentment is unbounded. 100, 200 years ago, if you told someone that they'd have like 1,000 square foot home with running water and like toilets and like a light bulb and this thing in their phone where they could like talk to like their grandma on the other side of the world, I think most people would be like, wow, like that must be like living like a god, like that's crazy, right? But today, like, I mean, damn, like, oh, you have an Android, bro? Like, damn, you don't even have an iPhone, dude. Like I want the Ferrari when I grow up, bro. Like, what? Like, people's contentment is unbounded. So I don't think it makes sense to optimize for society with maximal contentment. I'll leave my exact opinions on an ethical society a bit fuzzy, but let's jump to the next question then. How does society influence our ethics? In what ways does the way society is structured influence like what we believe is right and wrong? Joshua?
I feel like there's a good amount of indoctrination that happens when you're very young. Like I think you mentioned earlier that, you know, if you grow up in America, you're very sold on this idea of like freedom and liberty, which that happened when we were discussing like totalitarian governments. And so I feel like the society that you grow up in very directly influences what you think is right or wrong. So for example, we would look at like China and be like, yo, that's a totalitarian government. Like you would not want to live there because we've seen other things. But like probably someone who lives in China is like learning about their government from their standpoint, thinks they're living in a utopia.
Yeah.
And so like, maybe that's not as big of an ethical difference as you might, like, as one might believe, but I really think that it's just indoctrination, like your society directly influences what you believe.
Exactly, right? I think like the word indoctrination has strong connotations, but that's like basically what it is, right? Like we are like society in a way, like we are our society, right? Like if this is like us, like this much of it is like society, right? Something like society. And
Some
then, like
amount.
this is like our like parents, and then like this is our friends, and then like this is the internet. Or some shit like
Nice.
that. Like something like that. So like society obviously has like a huge influence on like who we are. So yeah. This is honestly a bad question. Sid.
I think it's society that makes ethics. So like there's that experiment where you know there's someone looking at you, you do something good, but if there's no one looking at you, you function the way you are, right? Like the thing that stops you from robbing a store or like shoplifting is the fact that you're scared. Oh, you get caught. So if society then wasn't like in like definitely non-existent, like you're not gonna have ethics, right? So that's
Yeah, I think you're definitely hitting on something important with like the fact that like ethics is something like we like to think about ethics as something explicit, but like we can also treat like ethical behavior as like being socialized, right? So like if we grow up to like if we grow up and society teaches us that like a component of us is literally society, such that like if I go out and like kill someone, like they are part of the same society as me, so like I'm like hurting myself. Like that is like another approach to ethics that like traditional societies, I'd argue, like take that you don't have to explicitly teach someone not to kill someone, you just have to teach them that like society is part of them and they're like hurting themselves. Gotcha.
You also have to consider though that while society is very much a part of us, it is also us over time, like our personal beliefs that like aggregate to change society. Like for example, my grandparents' beliefs about like religion or just about how you should live are very much based on like log kya kahenge, which is like what are people gonna say, right? But like my beliefs are very different from theirs. And so there is also some level of like personalization that happens that changes society back over time. So it's more like a back and forth rather than like just indoctrination. So I think that works.
Interesting. Yeah. It's like there's like dynamical system stuff, right? Like how the individual influences the society and like backwards. Yeah.
I feel like collective experience is also really important in with respect to society's perspective on things. So my grandparents, like my dad's side, went through the partition, right? And now they're like a little Islamophobic. Yeah. And like whenever like I argue with them about this, they'll be like, yeah, but like I saw someone who was Muslim burn down my house and like kill people. And like I obviously can never ever retort anything to that. So I'm like, sorry. So like, I mean like they've been like radicalized to such a point where like I'm like, okay, I just have to like remind myself that they saw something when they were like 5 years old that has permanently changed them. I just have to acknowledge that and like separate that from there. And I feel like another time this like came up was I was arguing with like one of my Singaporean friends who like believes that mandatory national service, he did it. He was like, it's great. It's really, really necessary. It has made like it's half the reason why Singapore is how like as good as it is. And I was just like, that's like 2 years of your life, dude. Like 18 to 20, that's like a long time. And he was like, no, but it's so good. but like just like the society I grew up in didn't value that. And
Yeah.
Singapore obviously prioritized that. It was just such a clear difference in our like.
Yeah, I think you're hitting on something really important with like shared experience. I'd make the argument that like a significant component of like ritualism is exactly that. The reason ritual serves so much is so salient in like traditional religion is because it brings societies together around like some like act that is seen to be like have like cosmic significance. So like with the fire rituals, for example, like there's like you have like the fire right in the middle, and then that's a terrible fire. And then like you have the people all around it, and like the lighting of the fire in the morning is literally like supposed to signify like the rebirth of like the sun, like society when it comes together around this like act that everyone believes is like holy and sacred and like fundamentally tied into the universe. Like that's like what brings people together. Like we are all waking up together to like literally bring another day into existence. So definitely, I think shared experience is like super important, and you see it in company culture too, right? So like there's a lot of like Silicon Valley talk about like building company culture, like how can I get like all the productivity out of my employees, right? So what they do now is stand up. So like I don't know if anyone has like interned at a startup, but like every day 9 a.m. everyone gets in this room and they do this thing called stand up, where they each go around and they talk about like what they did and like blah blah blah. And like recently, so that's like sort of a more traditional part of like a agile workflow. But like recently, there's been this idea of like adding rituals into it. So like these startups are doing like literal rituals where like it brings them together. I can't think of any off the top of my head.
TCS. My mom worked for TCS, and every morning 9 a.m. she had to stand up.
Yeah, like stand up. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But like there's some like more culty kind of stuff going on in startups now.
Really good workouts.
TCS.
It's known to be like great
Not-
place to work.
Okay, not the contractors who they send overseas, but like
Okay.
maybe in India. I
Yeah.
don't know.
Like that's why like there's a book by Yuval, like Sapiens.
Yeah, Sapiens. Yeah.
He like said that festivals are like one of the reasons like humans like beat every other like genus.
Yeah.
Like festivals are like so important.
No,
because-
and a lot of the Silicon Valley culture comes exactly from that book. Yeah, you're right.
Really?
Yeah.
From that book.
Yeah. I mean like a lot like everyone like Sapiens is one of the most highly rated book by Hacker News.
Yeah.
So like they're obsessed with this book. Sapiens is up there, Gödel Escher Bach is up there. There's a few others that are up there. Motorcycle Maintenance and the Zen of Life or something like that. Like no one has heard of this book, but like they're obsessed with it. But yeah, Sapiens is exactly what started that entire dialogue about like company culture. Milo.
Yeah, about this whole like Silicon Valley thing. I remember when I went to Japan, like they have this thing that like actually inherently, like at least according to people I talk to, like half the companies and half the schools do, right? All get up, they do this weird dance. This radio program plays on like the national radio every single
I think I've heard of this.
This weird song, it's like piano song, and everybody does this weird dance. And like there are these videos of just like massive companies, like thousands and thousands of people
Yeah.
standing on the front lawn, like doing this weird and like it's called radio calisthenics and stuff, but like it's supposed to be the same thing where like it's like, you know, productivity by like having like a shared experience group unity thing.
Yeah.
That, like, you know, you can talk about it, you've all been through it, you've all thought
Yeah.
it's like
Exactly, it brings people together. It's like what creates like a society, right? Yeah, Shahzadi.
Yeah, my one friend used to work at this like warehouse, and it's like known to be like super overtime. Like he used to work like 60-hour weeks, like
Oh shit.
forever. So every morning, like everybody quits there all the time. So like every morning they would do this like stretch dance thing. Like at the beginning of the shift, like they would all go with the manager like before they went to like pack or whatever, and they would just like stretch and like listen to music and stuff. And then it would like the productivity.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I like they've definitely run metrics on this. Like I could guarantee that like some Silicon Valley startup is out there that like runs metrics on like what percentage, like to what percentage your like daily rituals affect like number of lines of code written that day. Like I'm sure someone's measured it. There's like some analytics app out there.
Startup that like specializes in like creating these things.
Yeah, startup idea, bro. Build that Tartan hacks, dude. Or wait, no, that was last weekend. But yeah. Like I imagine you could do something like this. Okay, Cast, how much time do we have? All right, not enough time to discuss this basically, but like I we already talked like a bit about caste. I think one thing that I want to bring up is, to what extent is caste really unique to Indian society versus is it something that we just talk a lot about in Indian society that has like numerous parallels in other places? So like one parallel I'll bring up is feudalism, right? So we see feudal systems basically everywhere. It's sort of like an economic stage that like most civilizations seem to go through. So in Europe, during feudalism, you have like the king at the top, obviously, right? And then you have like the Catholic or like the priestly class, and then you have like the knights and like the lords or whatever, and then you have like the peasants at the bottom, right? So there's this very clear kind of like pyramidal kind of social system. You also have in actually I won't draw a new one. In China during the Shang dynasty, you have the same kind of system where you have the king, and then you have like this class of like lords basically. They're like landowners that own like specific regions, and they sort of have their own sort of like semi-autonomous communities. You have like the literati, I guess like I should have put that in over here. So like the Confucian scholars, that's like another class in there. Then you have these landowners, and then you have like the peasants, the nome at the bottom. So you see these feudal systems everywhere. Then also you have race in the US, right? So one sort of thing that someone like observed to me recently is like how in Silicon Valley, like the Bay Area at least, you have something that's like very similar to like a like race-based like caste system, in the sense that you have like so it's actually, so there's like Varna and Jati, right? So Varna is like this traditional like fourfold division into like Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, and then Shudras. So like the scholars and priests, the like kings and was it warriors? Yeah, exactly, knights, right? And then like the general populace, and then like the Shudras, which are like the peasants and like manual laborers. Then there's also Jati, right, which sort of like cross cuts these divisions in certain senses, and this is what we see in the last few hundred years. We see this Jati system where there's like these tribes essentially that like some seem to be like semi-Kshatriya, semi-Vaishya, or some seem to be like semi-Brahmin, semi-Kshatriya. Or like for example, like parts of my family, they're like Brahmins, but like in actuality, they were literally just like farming landowners. So like you see this in like like almost everywhere in the past few hundred years in India. You have this like Jati system, which is a lot more complicated than the Varna system that we're traditionally talked about. So sort of like a parallel to the Jati system that we see in the Bay Area, at least in California, is like how you have these like ethnicities that seem to perform like very, very specific like tasks. So like take for example the Vietnamese. Can anyone tell me what like tasks like the Vietnamese perform in like California? Who I know Yashka lives in the Bay. Does anyone else live in the Bay or California? This is also true in LA. What do the Vietnamese do in California?
I would say specifically like nail salons,
Right.
very much like run by Vietnamese.
Yeah, like nail salons, like hair salons, like Vietnamese people in California, like a significant majority of them like perform this very specific task. And this isn't like a stereotype, like this is like empirically backed by data. And the reason this is because when the Vietnamese were first migrating to the US in like the 60s and 70s, is like the first sort of immigrants started these like personal care businesses, and as their relatives showed up, et cetera, they also performed these like exact kind of tasks. Then we also have, like the Gujaratis. This is like more like the Patels. Like this is like US wide, right? What do the Patels do in the US? Can anyone like tell me what they do? Huh? Yeah, they do the hotels, right? Like literally every hotel you go to, it's not just like random Indian people running hotels. It's like hotels. It's very specific.
I would also say like tax, like people who like basically do taxes for other people are also weirdly like Gujarati in the Bay.
Yeah, interesting.
Every single tax person that my parents have ever gone to is like Gujarati.
Money, dude, the
It's
money.
so
Yeah,
weird.
right. So like we like in the so like this is an example of like an Indian group. But like for example, we can also take like I don't know, like there's other groups. Like this guy was just like listing out group after group of like people who just like perform like insanely like, yeah, Milo. Okay, yeah. I think like I've heard of that too. Yeah, yeah. So there's like Cambodians everywhere who like do donuts, right? So like my point, I guess, is that like these jati systems, in the sense where we have these like essentially tribes that perform very specific tasks, right? In India, like one jati, for example, is like the how am I forgetting their name? They're like these bookkeepers, like literally all of them are like librarians, and like they occupy this like job all over North India. These kind of like setups where you have ethnicities occupying very specific tasks, it isn't all that rare cross-culturally. So I don't think like we talk about the caste system in India like it's something completely out of the blue, that it's like very unique and like strange to India, but like I think we can pull out all these cross-cultural examples where that's not true. Next is how heuristics replace meritocracy. So what I mean by that is that a system that starts out as meritocratic often will eventually turn into a system where we instead start using heuristics instead of actual meritocracy. So like while at the start we might I had a really good example of this. There's okay. So like for example, getting into Harvard, right? Yeah. So like getting into Harvard, that's like meritocratic, right? Like it is hard to get into. Right. So like historically it was meritocratic, right? So it was pretty hard to get into Harvard. Like it still is for most people pretty hard to get into Harvard. There's a good chance that like most Harvard people are pretty smart. But there also is now like a significantly large portion of Harvard and like general Ivy League admits that are they're on legacy, right? They like a significant reason they got admitted is because they're these like white Northeast US kind of like what are they called? WASPs that like have basically lived in like gone to Ivy Leagues for generations WASPs? It's like white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. White Anglo-Saxon Protestants. It's like basically these like upper middle class to like upper class Northeast US like
Think
New
like
York
Gilmore Girls.
Yeah, New York rich
Like
family.
Emily Gilmore.
Yeah.
Like, the race in the US thing was like, I was talking to my sister about this, and like this like really concretized to me at CMU at college. There's like a disproportionate percentage of people who work in service jobs at most college campuses in the Northeast. I'm probably African American, and I see it here all the time.
Oh yeah.
Like it's crazy how many people who like work, I don't know, in the marketplace or somewhere else were Black, and it's so jarring once you notice it, and it's kind of almost terrifying how similar it is. Like
Definitely. And when you go to California, can anyone tell me what the equivalent is in California? Because we only have like 3% like Black people in California. So who replaces them? Yeah, exactly, right. And it's the exact same thing. So I used to go to UC Santa Cruz. I'm a transfer student. At UC Santa Cruz, all the workers in our like cafeterias, etc., they were all Hispanic. So again, that's like another good like example of this sort of like a jati system that we see in the US as well. With heuristics replacing meritocracy, Harvard like might have been like a pretty good like measurement of like, is this person like smart or not? So actually I'll say it this way. When a company wants to admit someone, so like in Silicon Valley, right? I'm using so many Silicon Valley examples. So like a CS like Google, right? When they go and they're like, who do we want to hire for the software engineering position? Like there is meritocracy in the sense that they're like, let's give this person a lead code test, right? That's like a highly meritocratic ideal. But actually getting your resume into the door, right, of like how do you get a Google person to review your resume and then decide, okay, let's send them the meritocracy test. A lot of that is a heuristic, right? Since Google gets hundreds, thousands of applications every single day, or not every single day, probably I don't know how many applications Google's get, but they get a lot of applications. So to cut through all of those thousands of applications, what they have to do is use these heuristics that basically tell them who is probably pretty likely to be meritocratically smart. So what they do to do that is like use things like, what college did this person go to? Oh damn, they went to Carnegie Mellon. Wow, okay, so maybe they're smart, right? So that's like a heuristic they might use. But like maybe the person from CMU wasn't even a CS major, and like I totally tricked Microsoft on this one because like I have seen you on my resume, but I'm not a CS major. But like I still passed the leak code test and whatever. So it's like, yeah, let's go. But like leak code, so like they use this heuristic, right, to like narrow down their pool, and then they have meritocracy. But like it is not so far in the foreseeable future where it's like, oh my God, we have like so many positions to hire. How are we gonna fill all these positions? Fuck the leak code. Let's just use the heuristic. If you're at Stanford, bro, you get a job. Like that is sort of how heuristics replace meritocracy in these systems. And over thousands of years, you can imagine that similar things happen on societal scales. So like that is something that like I'd also argue happens with caste. We saw that quote earlier about like Brahmins and like scholar like being well versed in traditional documents. Originally, it might have been a meritocratic system, but eventually, obviously, it becomes a heuristic that like, oh, if this person is like of a Brahmin family, therefore they must be like well versed. But when obviously that's not true. Okay, all right, we're like just at about time, but aesthetics real quick. Aesthetic value. What makes something beautiful? What do you guys think makes something beautiful? Sum it up in like a few words or a sentence.
Your personal opinion and also the things that you were exposed to for like a long time, and you might find more persuasive people and things that you were not.
Right? Yeah, that's a good opinion, Yashka.
But also objectively, like the golden ratio.
Right. So yeah, there are these like objective standards that we can take into account with like pictures. And then yeah, what Shahzadi said about like things we're used to seeing, things that we're like acclimated to, those are also kind of beautiful. Was John gonna say something?
Well, kind of, like I feel like a lot of like aesthetics in my mind has to like, I guess I'm thinking of it from a standpoint of like architecture or design. It's kind of like something that's functional but also has like significance to where it is and why it's there, and like, designed to like, I guess like seamlessly be like part of this environment and like I guess just benefit the things around it while also functioning.
Yeah, like function versus form. Yeah, that's an interesting kind of opinion. So a few things on aesthetics. The aesthetic tradition in India is obviously really long. The earliest literature is of course poetry, so you can imagine that aesthetics is a huge component. We have the DharmaShastras, which is from around this period, which defines like this thing called rasa theory, which is basically rasa literally means like juice or like a substance, right? Bharata Muni, the guy who wrote DharmaShastras, basically talks about these several rasas. I think there's like 9, and each one is like a specific flavor, and you can like mix these flavors in various ways to like create like interesting combinations, and they have like good combinations of these rasas and like bad combinations. And these rasas cut across various dimensions. So you have like color, like rasas for colors, you have rasas for like musical tones, you can have rasas for like dance steps, and also rasas in terms of like narratives. So like different narrative structures, right? Like a bit of love and a bit of war, violence and a little bit of like tragedy, blah, blah, blah. You can mix all of these into a narrative. And that's sort of what gives you something that is aesthetically pleasing. 1,000 years later, around here, we have the Kashmir Shaivism school of Anandavardhana and Abhinavagupta. These people basically come up with this thing called Dhvani theory, which is this other interesting aesthetic theory, which is about this idea of pervasion, basically, where if we have if we have some kind of, if we have like some poetry over here, there's like several words in this poetry, and there's like the literal meaning of each of these words, right? But then there's also this sort of vibe that they create. Dhvani, honestly, like the way they translate Dhvani, like sometimes it's like a feeling or essence. Sorry, what did you say?
I just said the vibes.
Yeah, the vibes. Yeah, they but like I'd say that like the best translation for like Dhvani is like literally vibes. Like all these words, like the guy basically says that like good poetry is poetry that is not about like what each word actually is, but like the Dhvani they create, like the vibe you get, you know, like you know when you're like watching a movie or like listening to like lo-fi hip hop, like there's like a vibe it creates. It's not about like each individual like note or each individual kind of like tweak in the symphony or whatever. It's about like the general kind of feeling that like pervades and even like over over replaces, what is the word I'm thinking of?
Overrides.
Overrides the actual words themselves. So you can have a dhvani that like, you can have like literal meaning A, and then like the opposite meaning B, is what the dhvani actually creates. And that could be like an interesting kind of like poetic structure. And obviously he gives like very specific examples of how to create dhvani under different conditions, et cetera, et cetera. So that's sort of like basic ideas in historical process of Indian aesthetic theory. All right, I mean, I guess like we're over time, but like, does anyone want to discuss these? What should one do with your life? How should one go about achieving these things in their life? How should a society be structured to impart ethical knowledge? Should society provide for those who don't contribute to society? And how should we decide who makes societal decisions? We already sort of discussed some of these, but is there anything here that someone really wants to discuss? All right, okay, that's chill. I mean, we're already over time. If you want to discuss anything like this, though, definitely feel free to stay after.